So the first sound that I used on the track was a sound from the Yamaha AM1X. The AM1X is a synth from 1997. It's an analog modelled synth, and there was a patch on there that was really nice. It had a sort of like a muted guitar sound, but then after a few tweaks, once you open the cutoff on the filter, it really comes to life. And it's got this really nice lush reverb and delay on it. And then they created this riff. So I use that riff on the breakdown, but then to build into sort of the transition of the track building up and getting more energy, I then change that riff to a similar riff but running on 16ths like an arpeggio. I also use the JP8080 for sort of a super saw sound to layer with that sound, just to give it a bit more thickness and really help lift the track when it sort of kicks in. So once I recorded them in, I just done a cut on the bottom end of the EQ, slight boost on the mid to high. That was for the AM1X, and then I did the same on the JP as well, low cut and slight boost. I also added ROM onto the JP just for some reverb, just to make it sound a bit nicer. So then when you play the two together, you've got this. Also, I created this stabby riff using the SH201. It's actually the same sound as using for my pad on the breakdown, and I just brought the attack right down, the release right down, and created this stabby riff. And then I've used Echo Boy for some delay, and then I've used the Phase Mistress to have some phasing onto it, with some reverb as well. If I take all the plugins off, it's quite flat. When you bring them all in, it really sort of gives the riff some movement. Then onto the pads. So the pads, I use the SH201, which is considered the poor man's JP8000. So it's made by Roland, and it's a great synth in its own right, to be fair. And it's got the super saw from the JP8000. It just doesn't have the same cutoff filter on there, and some of the parameters are on the JP8000 are missing from the SH201. But that said, it is a great synth on its own, and it can do a really nice super saw. So this is the pad that I used. And then to accompany that, I also used the Supernova 2 for another pad sound, just to layer with it. In addition to the SH201 and the Supernova, I also use the Roland Cloud JV1080 just for a bright string, sort of a high note, sort of tension string. So what that does is once it hits into the breakdown, it really sort of adds to the tension from the build up. And then I also used a sub pad as well, which was from my Korg Volca bass, which is this little thing here. The Volca bass has really got a nice sort of thick sub pad sound that you can get from it. It's got 3 oscillators, and you can sort of detune each oscillator against each other, so it really creates a nice thick sub pad sound. So I've recorded that in from that, and then added some reverb on there as well. So it's got like this sound. I'll use that on the breakdown. So then if I play all the pads and string together. Sounds really nice and lush, and as soon as you open that cut off on the SH201, it just really sort of comes alive. The bassline, so I use the Behringer MS1, which is a clone of the Roland SH101, and I created this sort of riff with the bass line. When it sounds pretty boring on its own, doesn't really sound like it would really drive the track as it is, but as soon as it's recorded in and you add delay and reverb on, it really does create a really nice bass line. So I'm using Echo Boy for the delay. Put some tape on there, and then I'm using Roam for some a little bit of reverb. If I take off all the plugins, so that was what we used on the bass line. No layering at all on the bass. I also used the Roland Cloud version of that synth, so the VST SH101, and I created this sort of like acidy riff just to accompany the bass line, just to help keep it driving. I've put the resonance quite high up, just to obviously give that, I can hear the sweep when I'm changing the cutoff. Take the effects off there. Again, it's quite boring because it's a mono synth and there's no effects on board. Bring the bass line in. They just really work well together. And all I'm doing is I'm just sweeping the filter up and down throughout. There's not really at any point where it's just constant. But doing that, it allows you to just sort of create different flows of the track as it's moving along. Now onto the drums. So the drums, I use the Novation drum station, which is considered the first ever clone of the Roland 909 and the 808. Now the drum station has got both sounds from both drum machines on there, And it's a few extra parameters that you've got on there that it wasn't on the original drum machines. The 909 was very present in the early to late 90s for techno and trance. So I used the 909 kick from the drum station. Very typical 909 sound. Now I've run all the drums through my analog desk. So the reason why I've done that is it's allowed me to have a bit more hands-on with the drums, EQ, levels, and it also has that sort of authentic analog grit hiss that you get when you're recording through an analog desk. So what I've done is I've used the gate on the kick because there was quite a bit of hiss coming through between each kick. So I've used the gate just to sort of cut in and cut out when the kicks come in and out, but it still brings in some of that hiss as well. I've used a compressor on the kick just to obviously put a compression on there. Then I've used the 909 clap. And I've used the 808 clap as well. And then what I've done was at the end of the bar, I've also used the 808 clap, but with a delay on it. So just adds a bit of variation with the loop. So when you layer the two claps together with the delay as well. Then I've used the 808 open hat. And also the 808 closed. Then I've used the 909 closed hat. And I've just used the LFO tool just to sort of give that bit of a ducking effect on the kick. And I've used the open hat for the 909. Used the 909 ride as well as the crash, and I also reversed the crash once I'd recorded it in to create a reverse. And then I've used the 909 snare as well. Now all this was recorded in via MIDI, so send MIDI out to the drum machine, and then you basically just record each channel. So once all the drums were recorded in, it sounds like this. And if we bring the bass line and the acid line. Now another thing that I also done with the drums was I loaded a sample from an old 90s sample pack, and it had this one sort of long stem sample with one shots, and then I just sliced it all up and just put it into different pads on the drum machine and just tried to create a rhythm with the sounds. So I just drew in on the MIDI editor. I just sort of hit random notes and just tried to create some kind of rhythm. It helps the drums sort of as they're progressing. What I also done was just for a couple of effects. I didn't go too into great detail with loads of effects. I used the AM1X, and there was a couple of effects on there that I liked. So once I'd recorded my lead in from the AM1X, I just recorded some of the effect sounds from it. I just use the Echo Boy delay just to add some delay on there, and the Native Instruments ROM as well for some reverb. And just put on some Echo Boy delay and ROM on the LFO tool just to give it that ducking sound as well. A very cliche type sweep, but it works really well. And finally, the vocal. So what it actually sounds like on the track is that there's one person whispering, but it's actually two. Now, I actually used both my daughters on this, and I got them to do about 20 takes each, and I just sort of picked what I liked and sort of created the line that is used on the track, which is Ecstasy in My Fantasy. So this is the first child.
Ecstasy.
And then this is the second child.
Ecstasy. Ecstasy.
And that's them both together. So it does actually sound like one person, but it is two. And then all I've done is I've just created a send with some delay and reverb on there, just to obviously, so it's not completely dry, but I created a send so I've got the mix of the too dry and the wet.
Ecstasy.
You can see it's sort of quite a heavy delay and reverb on there. So that's the vocal, and that's it really for the sounds used. I just started to build out once I've got my recordings and set the structure of the track how I wanted. Got that typical, classic trance sort of structure. It's got the intro, quite a long breakdown, two main sections, rather than sort of the conventional one main section that you've got now. What I did for the grouping, so I send them to buses. So I've got the drum bus. And the drum bus I used on there a liquid mix console. So this is an old Firewire unit. It's not supported anymore, which is why I'm needing to use the J bridge to get it working, because it doesn't work in the latest version of Cubase with it being 64-bit. But it's got some great emulations on there of some classic hardware compressors and EQ. So I used on here the US Modern Copycat, which is basically an emulation of the Distressor compressor. And what I like about it is that it's got the nuke setting on the ratio, which really helps you sort of really punch the drums through. So it's got a really nice texture to it anyway when you're using it, and it really helps to sort of glue your drums together and really make them punch. I find that I never get my drum sounds lost in the mix using this. The bass bus, I use the PSP Infinistrip plugin, and it's got different gains on there, 70s, 60s, 80s, 90s, an 80s pre on there, a VCA compressor, and then a EQ just on a slight boost on the bass, and that's all I've used on there. On the Whisper bus, I used the liquid mix twice. So I used this emulation of the Universal Audio 1176, and it's basically just to level out the vocal. And then I've used another compressor, which is just for preference on flavor and texture that it gives off. But other than that, there's nothing else with the vocal that I've done. And the lead bus, so I've used again the PSP Infinistrip. I'm a big fan of this plugin. It's got some really good pre's and compressors on there. So I've used an 80s pre again. I've used a FET compressor, and then an EQ just with a slight boost on the top of the EQ. I've got the LFO tool just to give it a bit of a duck, not too much against the kick. And then I've EQ'd on a slight boost on the mid. And then I've done a low cut on as well, just to cut out some of the bottom end of the EQ on the lead. The FX bus, nothing's on that. I've not touched anything with it, just left as it was. And then on the pad bus, I again just left as it was. I like to use my hardware as it is, as much as I can. I'd rather just sort of let the synth do what it is there to do, and let it be natural, and just sort of control bits of the sound where I need to. My master bus, now on my master bus on this, I used the Fab Filter Pro MB, which was to control the bass and the highs, sort of tight bass and control the highs. And it's a preset that I use on there, and I just sort of tweak it accordingly. And then after that, I've used the Liquid Mix again, and this is an emulation of an SSL 4000, I think it is. Then I also use a Tube EQ on there too. Then I run it into some tape from the Slate Digital virtual tape machine, and then I go back into the SSL again with the same emulation. And then after that, I've got some EQ, which I just do a simple cut on the bottom end at 35 hertz, a cut on the top end at 17,500 hertz, and then I do a side cut on the bottom end, just to take out some of that width of the bass line, because you want to keep that bass sort of nice and tight and central in the sort of the mono area. And that's it. So now what I'll do is I'm just going to give you a play of the track from the breakdown up until the end of the first main section. So that's the track, and I hope that was useful. What I will say is that although I have used hardware for all my sounds, barring a couple, that doesn't mean say that you can't create this in VSTs. It is very simple to do. you know, you can get the 909 sounds from anywhere in any sample pack, as well as the 808. They've been going for 30-40 years. The sounds from them are readily available. The other sounds, sort of the pad sounds, you know, you can use your Serum and Spire or Silent one as well. You know, they're all capable of creating that you know, classic sound. You don't need to use the hardware. It is just a personal choice using the hardware, but you can create any of these sounds in any VST. So don't be thinking that you need to have the hardware to do this, because you don't. What I will say as well is, even though I've used this as my master chain, that doesn't necessarily mean this was the actual end chain that was used on the master for the vinyl and the digital release, which is going to be coming out soon. But this was just a master chain that I prefer to use whilst I'm just getting a nice clean sort of end product. There is a limiter on it as well on the stereo out, which I use FabFilter Pro L2. No, it needed a gain boost of 7 dB. That's because I gain all my channels down. So I set my pre-gain on all the channels to -18, and then adjust the fader to adjust the volume as I need to. The export of this, what was used for the vinyl, was basically I had all this taken off, and then I had it professionally mastered for vinyl. So that concludes that for the In My Fantasy track, and I hope it was useful. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe to the channel, and you'll get notifications of further content coming from the channel.